So, I want you to imagine a predator. And not just any predator, but one that is perfectly, almost biologically adapted to exploit the blind spots of a rapidly modernizing society.
Right, because when we think of apex predators, our minds usually go straight to the wild. We picture wolves or tigers, creatures that have spent millennia adapting to the specific camouflage of a jungle.
Exactly. But consider what a predator looks like when its jungle is this sprawling concrete metropolis of 10 million people. What does that camouflage look like when it isn't made of foliage?
It's made of the wealth gap.
Yes. It's constructed from that widening, totally invisible gap between the ultra-rich and the desperately poor. And today we are taking a deep dive into the psychology and the forensic reality of a killer who weaponized that gap.
And we really need to emphasize that he didn't just shock a nation, he completely broke its criminal justice system.
He really did. I mean, he exposed structural flaws so deep that he forced a literal decades-long reconstruction of an entire country's legal and investigative apparatus.
A reconstruction that is actually culminating right now in the year 2026.
Right. So to understand the legal landscape of South Korea today, our mission in this deep dive is to clinically dissect the case of Yoo Young-chul,
The Raincoat Killer.
the Raincoat Killer. Between September 2003 and July 2004, he murdered at least 20 people in a spree that fundamentally obliterated the existing paradigms of East Asian criminology.
And we are approaching this not as some, sensationalized story. We're doing a severe clinical autopsy of systemic failure.
Absolutely. And to do that properly, we're pulling from a really specific stack of sources. We aren't just looking at the historical true crime documentation.
Right. The backbone of our analysis is a really comprehensive 2026 forensic and sociological review of the case.
Well, I'm with a highly specialized National Institutes of Health study. That one focuses on the pathology of cannibalistic serial killers.
Which is heavy, but so necessary for this. And we're also looking at how this trauma was digested culturally, through reviews of the 2008 neo-noir film The Chaser.
And the 2021 Netflix docuseries.
The inclusion of that NIH study is particularly crucial for us today, because this is not just a simple narrative about a man wielding a hammer.
No, it's a forensic examination of extreme clinical narcissism. It's about deep-seated, weaponized hostility.
And most importantly, it's a look at the catastrophic consequences that unfold when institutions just completely fail to protect the most vulnerable people in a society.
Yeah. So to truly grasp the mechanics of that hostility, we have to look at the incubation of this predator. We have to examine the environment that cultivated him.
Right, going back to the beginning.
Yoo Young-chul was born in April 1970 in Gocheng County, down in the Jeollanam-do province. And the defining characteristic of his early life was just absolute crushing poverty.
But the psychology of resentment doesn't usually stem from poverty in a vacuum. I mean, it stems from relative deprivation.
That distinction is so vital. He wasn't living in a society where everyone was equally destitute.
Far from it. He grew up directly comparing his family's severe destitution to the conspicuous, rapidly expanding wealth of neighboring households.
Right. This was during a period of hyper-speed economic growth in South Korea. The nation was rapidly modernizing, creating vast amount of wealth almost overnight.
But when you are entirely left out of that kind of aggressive economic miracle, you don't just feel poor.
Yeah.
You feel actively discarded.
Exactly. You feel that society has decided you are worthless while they're rewarding the people right across the street. And that dynamic breeds a very specific, slow-motion crystallization of anger.
And the environment inside his home offered absolutely no sanctuary from that rejection.
None at all. His maternal grandmother later went on record stating that life was so unbearably difficult that she actively considered killing him when he was young.
Wow. Just because of the financial strain.
Yeah, simply because she viewed his existence as a lifelong, unbearable financial burden to her daughter.
When you look at developmental criminology, that specific type of profound early rejection, I mean, the literal communication to a child that their very existence is a burden, is a massive red flag.
It really is. And this is where that NIH study on cannibalistic serial killers provides a chilling framework.
Right, because the researchers analyzed the pathology of offenders who escalated to extreme post-mortem degradation, which includes cannibalism.
And what did they find?
They found a profound statistical correlation with specific early life environments. These offenders demonstrate significantly higher rates of early low socioeconomic status.
And profound parental abandonment.
Exactly. They come from environments completely devoid of basic emotional security.
It creates a baseline of hostility toward the world. But even with that baseline, people often look for a way out, right? They look for a lifeline.
And for you, that lifeline was art.
Yeah. He actually had aspirations to attend a specialized arts high school. In a society that places immense pressure on educational pedigree, this was like his planned route to legitimacy.
He wanted to be recognized for a talent.
But that entire dream was dismantled during a medical interview process. Administrators discovered he was colorblind.
From a clinical perspective, the denial of that pro-social outlet is a devastating pivot point. It seems like a mundane, bureaucratic medical disqualification to us.
Right, but you have to view it through the lens of his existing narcissism and his deep-seated feelings of inadequacy.
To him, it wasn't a medical fact. It was a profound systemic humiliation.
Society was once again telling him that he was biologically defective and unwelcome in their institutions. And he didn't just accept it and find a new career path.
No, he retreated entirely into this eccentric, isolated personality. He spent his time obsessively fiddling with drawing pencils instead of paints, just turning inward.
Embarrassing that rejection.
And without a legitimate, socially acceptable path to achieve status, his behavior began to sharply deviate into criminality.
If we examine his forensic timeline, the escalation is glaring long before he ever commits a murder.
Yeah, he built a staggering criminal resume of 14 separate convictions prior to his 2003 killing spree.
I want to look closely at that escalation because it really maps the evolution of his pathology. Starting in 1988, he enters the juvenile justice system for petty theft.
And by 1991, he is graduated to the adult penal system.
But look at how the crimes change. He transitions from simple theft to forgery and identity theft by 1998. He is learning how to manipulate systems, how to falsify who he is.
And then the critical shift happens. The violence enters his repertoire.
Right. In 2000, he's convicted of child sexual abuse and rape. He serves 3.5 years for that. And almost immediately upon his release in 2002, he is apprehended again for attempted rape.
From an investigative standpoint, viewing those 14 convictions merely as a rap sheet is a fundamental failure of analysis.
Why is that?
Because the South Korean penal system at the time was functioning entirely as an incubator for his pathology. He spent the better part of 7 years in adult facilities.
Just immersed in a subculture of criminality.
Exactly. Learning how police investigate, learning the limits of forensic science at the time, and really refining his ability to deceive authority.
Let me challenge the institutional logic there. You have an individual who goes from stealing bicycles to committing child rape. That is an astronomical leap in predatory behavior.
It's a huge escalation.
How does an entire penal and judicial system process a man 14 separate times and fail to recognize that they are housing a rapidly escalating predator? Why wasn't he flagged?
Because the architecture of the system was entirely reactionary, not analytical. The justice system was siloed.
Meaning they didn't talk to each other.
Right. Property crimes were processed by one division, sexual offenses by another. The courts evaluated each individual charge in a complete vacuum.
Just applying a standardized penalty for the specific infraction.
There was no mechanism to map the psychological trajectory of the offender. They didn't see an apex predator refining his methodology. They saw a persistent nuisance who kept catching different charges.
And the NIH study explicitly points out that offenders with severe brain abnormalities, which are strongly correlated with extreme violence and cannibalism, often display this exact pattern of escalating, diverse criminal behaviors.
But the system wasn't designed to measure hostility or assess neurological risk factors. It was merely a machine designed to dispense discrete punishments.
So he is sitting in this incubator, his crimes are escalating, and his baseline anger is hardening. But criminologists always look for the catalysts, right?
The specific events that take a generalized anger and focus it into a lethal obsession.
Exactly. And for you, the first major catalyst occurred in 1994 when his 32-year-old brother died by suicide. In psychological profiles, this is often referred to as his Sweeney Todd moment.
That's a powerful comparison. It instilled an incredibly intense, albeit vague, desire for absolute revenge against the world.
Right. He didn't blame his brother. He blamed the systemic unfairness of society for crushing his brother. But the final snap, the moment the scope narrowed and the target locked on, happened while he was incarcerated between 2000 and 2003.
During that specific prison term, his wife initiated divorce proceedings and took custody of their son.
And the context of who his wife was is absolutely paramount to understanding his future victimology. She was a former masseuse.
Which is a profession that frequently overlapped with the escort and sex work industry in South Korea.
Consider the psychology of that moment for him. He is locked in a cage, entirely stripped of his power, his autonomy, and his status.
And in that moment of absolute vulnerability, the woman he views as his property, a woman whose profession he simultaneously utilized and deeply judged, abandons him.
That specific rejection acted as a supersaturating agent. His generalized rage crystallized into a lethal, targeted misogyny.
He no longer simply hated the wealthy for having the resources he lacked. He now possessed a virulent hatred for women.
Specifically marginalized women in the sex industry, whom he perceived as ultimate betrayers.
If we look at the neurobiological models discussed in the NIH research, triggers like a divorce or a family suicide are merely the catalysts.
They're just the spark.
Exactly. The underlying pathology, the underdevelopment in the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala dysfunction, often associated with low socioeconomic trauma, that is the dry brush.
And the system had allowed that brush to pile up for decades. The divorce was simply the match that ignited it.
Which brings us to September 2003. Yoo Young-chul is released from prison. But he is not returning to society to reintegrate.
No, his resentment has been fully weaponized. He immediately sets his sights on the social structures he feels humiliated him, and this initiates phase Y of his terror, the Hammer murders.
The clinical timeline for phase I is brief but intensely violent, spanning just from September to November of 2003.
And he begins a highly disciplined spree of targeted home invasions. He doesn't strike randomly.
No, he specifically maps out the most affluent districts in Seoul neighborhoods like Gangnam-gu and Jongno-gu. He is hunting the wealthy elderly.
He is going after the literal bastions of the elite, the Beverly Hills of Seoul.
Precisely. And the forensic details of his methodology demonstrate a terrifying level of premeditation. His signature weapon wasn't something he just picked up at a hardware store.
He custom-modified a 4-kilogram sledgehammer. He intentionally shortened the handle.
And the physics of that modification are crucial. A long handle gives you leverage, but it's unwieldy indoors and impossible to conceal.
Right. By shortening it, he created a weapon that he could hide under a jacket, but one that retained enough mass in the iron head to deliver catastrophic blunt force trauma in close quarters.
And he didn't leave the effectiveness of this weapon to chance. The sources detail how he actually went into the mountains and tested the hammer on stray dogs.
From an investigative standpoint, that detail is incredibly significant.
Yeah, he was calibrating the weapon to ensure a one-hit kill. He wanted to understand the kinetic force required to crush a skull instantly.
To minimize noise, prevent any struggle, and avoid the unpredictable blood spatter that comes from a prolonged physical altercation.
It is a level of logistical preparation that mimics the stunning of animals in an industrial slaughterhouse.
But I think we have to look deeper into the psychology of practicing on those dogs. It wasn't just physical calibration, it was psychological desensitization.
He was practicing the act of extinguishing life without empathy.
And that chilling efficiency was immediately evident in his first recorded strikes. On September 24, 2003, he breaches a home in Gangnam-gu.
He immediately stabs a 72-year-old university professor in the neck to neutralize him.
And then bludgeons both the professor and his 67-year-old wife to death with the modified hammer.
Just 2 weeks later, on October 9, he strikes in Jongno-gu. He annihilates an entire generational household.
An 85-year-old woman, her 60-year-old daughter-in-law, and her 35-year-old handicapped grandson. Total eradication.
When you analyze those crime scenes, the spatial and geographical choices he made completely broke the investigative paradigms of the Seoul Metropolitan Police.
He specifically selected detached, 2-story Western-style homes.
And the reason he chose those specific homes is a fascinating intersection of architecture and psychology.
These homes were symbols of immense wealth, right?
Yeah.
Surrounded by high walls and heavy gates. They were designed as fortresses to keep the poorer outside world at bay.
But you realize that those high walls offered a dual function. Once he bypassed the perimeter, those same walls provided him with absolute cover.
They shielded him from the eyes of neighbors, from street-level patrols, from anyone who might witness the violence inside. He weaponized their own architectural exclusivity against them.
But the most baffling aspect of these crime scenes for the investigators was the staging. He would tear the houses apart.
He pulled out drawers, overturned furniture, scattered belongings across the floor to simulate a frenzied, botched robbery.
Yet he systematically left massive amounts of cash, bearer bonds, and high-value jewelry completely untouched in plain sight.
You have to understand how deeply that paralyzes a traditional homicide investigation. Detectives are trained to look for a motive.
Right. In 2003, if an affluent family was murdered in their home, the operating theory was almost exclusively robbery-homicide.
So when investigators walked into these scenes, seeing a massacre but finding the cash still sitting on the coffee table, it short-circuited their methodology.
They could not comprehend a perpetrator who possessed the risk tolerance to invade a mansion but lacked the financial motivation to take the money. It contradicted every established profile they utilized.
Because they were looking for a thief who panicked, when they should have been looking for an executioner.
If we apply the FBI's typologies of serial killers, Yoo represents a terrifying hybrid of the missionary and the power control killer.
The missionary killer operates under the delusion that they are on a moral crusade to rid society of a specific, undesirable group.
And for Yoo, the wealthy elite were a cancer that had oppressed him and caused his family suffering. He believed he was enacting cosmic justice.
Simultaneously, the power aspect is evident in the staging. By leaving the money behind, he was sending a deliberate message to the police and to society.
Essentially saying, I am not a desperate criminal stealing your scraps. I am a judge, and this is a penalty.
Exactly. The thrill came from having absolute, unchecked dominion over the lives of the people who sat at the very top of the social hierarchy.
But that profound sense of control met a harsh reality check on November 18, 2003, which marks the definitive turning point of Phase 1.
He infiltrates a home in Yeongno-gu and executes an 87-year-old woman and her 53-year-old housekeeper with the hammer.
However, after the murders, his discipline slips. He attempts to pry open a heavy safe using a tool, and in the process, he accidentally cuts his hand.
The psychological panic of that moment must have been intense. He spent 7 years in the penal system. He knows exactly what a drop of blood means.
Yes, he is highly aware of the advancing capabilities of DNA forensics. He knows that leaving biological material at the scene completely compromises his anonymity.
So to counter this catastrophic error, he improvises a severe forensic countermeasure. He systematically sets the house on fire,
calculating that the intense heat will incinerate the cellular structure of his blood and destroy the DNA evidence.
It is a calculated, desperate move, but arson radically changes the dynamic of the investigation. The police might have been confused about the motive of the bludgeonings, but you cannot ignore a burning mansion in the wealthiest district of the capital.
The arson brings a massive, intense wave of police heat and media scrutiny down on these specific neighborhoods. The perimeter was tightening.
And right as the police pressure is forcing him into a tactical cooling-off period, he experiences another profound personal trigger.
In late 2003, he had actually attempted to pursue a romantic relationship with a woman working as an escort.
He became intensely attached and even proposed to her after only 3 months. But she eventually discovered the truth about his extensive criminal background, his prison time, and his divorce.
She categorically rejected him and demanded he never contact her again.
The confluence of these two events creates a perfect, lethal storm.
Right, because the heightened police presence in Gangnam and Jeongnam makes hunting the wealthy statistically impossible for him. He's tactically grounded.
Simultaneously, the absolute rejection by a sex worker acts as a massive accelerant on the misogyny he had been harboring since his divorce.
He is forced to pivot his methodology, and that pivot plunges us into the terrifying reality of Phase 2.
Phase 2 spans from March to July of 2004. We call this the office-style killings. This is the period where the narrative shifts from a twisted, performative class warfare into an absolute claustrophobic nightmare of forensic decimation.
After the rejection, his victimology completely abandons the elderly rich. He turns his hammer entirely toward marginalized female sex workers.
The psychology here is abhorrent, but clinically significant. In his fractured rationale, he viewed these women as rotten, blood-corrupting society, projecting all his anger about his ex-wife and his recent rejection onto them.
But from a purely predatory standpoint, he targeted them for a much colder reason. They were socially invisible.
He knew that in the rigid social hierarchy of South Korea, their disappearances would not trigger the same immediate, massive police response as the murder of a wealthy professor.
The logistical execution of this phase is where his pathological need for control reaches its zenith. He completely abandons the high-risk home invasions.
He realizes that breaking into fortresses is no longer viable. Instead, he decides to draw the victors into his own heavily controlled territory.
An office cell he rented in the Mapogu district. An office cell is essentially a multi-purpose building with small studio apartments, common in Seoul, offering a high degree of anonymity among transient renters.
But logistically, I have to ask you to explain the mechanics of the abduction. These women operate in a highly dangerous profession. Their personal safety and vetting of clients are paramount to their survival.
Absolutely.
How does a single man convince over a dozen highly cautious women to willingly walk into his private apartment?
He exploited their systemic fear of authority. The escort and massage parlor industry in South Korea operated in a very dark, legal gray area.
The workers were constantly under threat of vice raids and legal penalization.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You understood this vulnerability perfectly. He procured a highly realistic, forged police identification badge and a pair of professional handcuffs.
He would call the dispatch agencies, posing as a standard client, to arrange a meeting.
When the women arrived at the designated street corner or motel room, he would drop the client persona, flash the fake police ID, and claim they were under arrest.
He utilized the handcuffs to physically secure them, leveraging their terror of being processed by the actual legal system to force them into compliance.
He then simply walked them back to his office cell under the guise of an undercover operation.
It is the absolute pinnacle of predatory camouflage. He is using the exact symbol of societal protection, the police badge, as the lure.
He brings the crime scenes directly into his own living space, which gives him infinite time to enact his violence and control the environment.
But again, from an investigative view, how does a man run a continuous cycle of abduction and murder out of a densely populated apartment building over the course of months without a single neighbor, landlord, or beat cop noticing something is catastrophically wrong?
It points directly back to your concept of social invisibility. When these women started failing to return to their agencies, the immediate assumption by their employers and by the police, if they were even notified, was not foul play.
Because of the stigma and the financial realities of the industry, many of these women carried significant debts to their dispatchers.
The operating assumption was simply that they had fled to another city to escape their debts or jumped to a different clandestine agency.
There was zero proactive police investigation into missing sex workers in Mapogu. The apathy of the system provided you with an impenetrable shield.
Once he had them secured inside that apartment, the nature of the violence shifted entirely.
During Phase 1, the hammer was used for swift, efficient executions. In Phase 2, the violence became prolonged, and it was focused on the total destruction of the victims' identities.
The forensic countermeasures he deployed inside that office cell are among the most calculated and gruesome in the history of modern criminology.
He was acutely aware that the crime scene investigation capabilities of the Seoul police, specifically regarding fingerprinting and trace evidence, were rapidly advancing.
To completely neutralize those capabilities, he began systematically dismembering the victims. He would reduce a human body into 18 to 20 distinct pieces.
Part of that is the cold logistics of transport. You cannot carry a whole body out of an apartment building without being seen.
But it was also about making identification biologically impossible.
Exactly. He focused heavily on defeating the automated fingerprint identification systems, or AFIS, which was the primary method of identifying John and Jane Does.
He meticulously severed the fingertips of every victim, sometimes mutilating the dermal ridges, and flushed the tissue down the toilet to ensure they could never be recovered.
He would decapitate the remains and intentionally smash the facial structures and dental arcades with the hammer to prevent facial recognition or dental record matching.
The sources note a detail that I find psychologically staggering. He performed this dismemberment in his small bathtub.
And he would run the shower continuously to wash the body parts, draining away the blood, the bodily fluids, and any trace evidence like his own hair or skin cells.
And he did all this methodically for hours while playing loud classical or electronic music to drown out the sounds of the saw and the hammer.
It strips away any illusion of a crime of passion. It wasn't a frenzy. It was a cold, industrial assembly line of human destruction operating right in the middle of a bustling city.
He would then pack the sanitized pieces into black plastic garbage bags, hail a taxi, and bury them in shallow graves in the heavily wooded mountains near Bangwon Temple, or simply abandon them at active construction sites.
This methodical destruction is where we must integrate the findings of the NIH study on pathological cannibalism.
Following his eventual capture, Yoo made a confession that deeply unsettled the psychiatric evaluators. He claimed that he had consumed the livers of at least 4 of his offensive victims.
He stated he did this to cleanse his spirit and absorb their energy.
Now, it is important to note that forensic pathologists could not definitively prove this, simply because the remains were so thoroughly destroyed and decomposed by the time they were recovered.
But clinically, whether he actually consumed the tissue or simply harbored a deep delusional fantasy that he did, the psychological implications are profound.
The NIH study is very clear on this. When you administer the hair psychopathy checklist, the PCLR, to an offender like this, the results are terrifying.
You scored a 38 out of 40 on the PCLR. To give that context, a normal citizen might score a 1 or a 2. A career criminal currently incarcerated might score around a 22.
The clinical threshold for severe psychopathy is 30. A score of 38 denotes an almost biologically total absence of empathy, remorse, or human connection.
It signifies a subject who views other human beings merely as objects to be manipulated or consumed.
The cannibalistic ideation, as the NIH outlines, moves beyond standard psychopathy. It represents a pathology rooted in the absolute ultimate desire for post-mortem degradation.
It is not enough to simply extinguish the victim's life. He needed to completely erase their existence, dismantle their physical form, and literally assimilate them into his own body.
It is the ultimate expression of power and control over the people he felt had rejected him.
There is, however, one glaring exception during Phase 2 that proves his methodology wasn't strictly down to his misogynistic ideology.
Right, it was also driven by an incredibly volatile narcissistic rage.
In April 2004, his 6th victim in this phase was not a female sex worker. It was a 44-year-old male street vendor named An Jae-sun.
And the catalyst for this murder was almost absurdly trivial. The vendor had sold Yoo counterfeit Viagra.
That single perceived slight, being cheated out of a small amount of money and feeling his intelligence was insulted, was enough to warrant a death sentence in Yoo's mind.
His reaction was immediate and absolutely ruthless. He didn't use the office tell for this. He physically overpowered the vendor, wrestled him into his own van, restrained him with the handcuffs, and murdered him.
To prevent identification, he used a saw to completely sever the vendor's hands, discarding them separately, and then set the van on fire with the body inside.
It demonstrates that while he had preferred target profiles, his capacity for lethal violence could be triggered by anyone who made him feel inferior or disrespected.
So to summarize the reality of Seoul in the summer of 2004, you have an apex predator operating a literal slaughterhouse out of a studio apartment.
He is impersonating law enforcement to abduct women off the streets. He is hauling garbage bags full of human remains into the mountains in the trunks of taxis.
And the official authorities, the entire apparatus of the state, are completely, terrifyingly in the dark. This brings us to the systemic failures that allowed this to happen.
And the incredible fact that it took a civilian to finally stop him.
The inability of the police to detect this massive loss of life was not merely incompetence, it was a structural failure defined by a phenomenon known as linkage blindness.
In 2004, the police infrastructure in Seoul was aggressively territorial. The precincts in different districts operated like entirely isolated fiefdoms.
They were competing for funding, for prestige, and for closure rates.
Because Yoo's murders crossed geographical boundaries, the wealthy seniors in Gangnam and Jongno, the missing sex workers originating from various districts and disappearing into Mapo, the data was never centralized.
Explain the mechanism of that blindness. We aren't talking about a modern cloud database where a detective types in a keyword and sees every related case in the country, are we?
Not at all. We are talking about highly localized databases and, in many cases, physical paper files.
A precinct in Gangnam investigating a bludgeoning had absolutely no protocol or technological incentive to cross-reference their crime scene data with missing persons reports filed by massage parlors in Mapo.
They weren't sharing forensics. They weren't comparing suspect descriptions. It took a full month after a particularly brutal murder in Haewadong for the Seoul Metropolitan Police leadership to finally force the disparate district chiefs into a joint task force meeting.
And even when forced to sit at the same table, they were looking at the evidence through the wrong lens.
They were convinced they were hunting an organized gang committing grudge killings.
The conceptual framework of a single, highly mobile serial killer bridging the gap between extreme wealth and extreme poverty was simply outside their operational imagination.
And that structural blindness led to agonizing, tragic near misses. The most infuriating of which occurred in January 2004, right in the dead center of his killing spree.
Yoo Young-chul was actually apprehended by the police.
He was arrested, but not for murder. He was picked up on a minor, unrelated theft charge.
But here is the detail that truly indicts the system. While he was sitting in custody for that minor theft, Yoo actually confessed to the murders. He told the police what he had done.
And the investigators entirely dismissed him. They looked at his rap sheet, saw a career defined by petty theft, forgery, and sexual assault, and concluded that he did not fit the profile of a criminal mastermind capable of executing wealthy elites.
They assumed he was a low-level grifter, fabricating a grandiose, sensational story to gain attention or manipulate the system.
They didn't even attempt to corroborate his confession with a physical evidence from the crime scenes. After 2 days in holding, they released him back onto the streets.
They had the architect of national trauma in handcuffs. He gave him the blueprint, and they opened the door for him.
So if the combined might of the Seoul police force couldn't catch him, who did?
It wasn't a brilliant forensic analyst realizing the connection. It was a local businessman. It was the owner of a clandestine massage parlor.
This is the moment the narrative shifts from a police procedural into desperate civilian vigilantism. The parlor owner didn't have access to AFIS or psychological profiles.
But he had a ledger, and he had basic deductive reasoning. He noticed a terrifying, undeniable pattern.
Several of his employees had vanished without a trace over the preceding months. And when he audited his call logs, he realized that every single missing woman had disappeared immediately after being dispatched to a client calling from the exact same mobile phone number.
Yoo had finally become arrogant. He believed the women were so invisible and the system so apathetic that he didn't even need to switch burner phones.
He used the same number to lure multiple victims from the exact same agency.
In July 2004, that specific mobile number appeared on the parlor's caller ID again. Yoo was attempting to summon another victim.
But the owner didn't call the police to report a suspicion. He knew the police wouldn't prioritize a call about an escort. Instead, he organized an ambush.
He and several of his male staff members went to the designated meeting point near a Grand Mart in the Mapogu district.
When Yoo arrived, the civilian staff physically engaged him, overpowered him, and held him down on the street.
Only after they had secured the serial killer did a lone, entirely unprepared police officer arrive on the scene to officially take him into custody.
You would assume that is the end of the nightmare. The civilians did the heavy lifting, the monster is finally in custody, and the system can take over.
But the sheer incompetence of the authorities hadn't peaked yet, had it?
It really hadn't. While inside the police station, under heavy guard and suspected of multiple homicides, Yoo deployed a manipulation tactic he had successfully utilized years prior in 2002 to escape a rape charge.
He suddenly collapsed and began faking a severe epileptic seizure.
And you have to look at the physiology of that deception. He is thrashing, simulating choking, creating absolute chaos in the precinct.
The officers are panicked. They lack basic medical protocol for securing a dangerous suspect during a health crisis.
Instead of calling for secure medical transport, they simply loosened his handcuffs to treat the emergency.
And the moment the restraints were relaxed, the seizure miraculously ended. You simply stood up, shoved past the bewildered officers, and walked straight out the front door of the police station.
He vanished back into the city. It required a massive, frantic manhunt lasting 12 hours to finally recapture him.
The sheer, unmitigated embarrassment for the police force was monumental.
But that embarrassment pales in comparison to a specific, horrifying moment of state failure that was captured by the media shortly after his final recapture.
I want you to deeply visualize this moment because it perfectly encapsulates the volcanic anger the South Korean public felt toward their institutions.
Yoo is finally secured. He is wearing his infamous yellow raincoat, being marched through a gauntlet of flashing cameras and screaming press toward the prosecutor's office.
The families of the victims are there. The mother of one of the young women, a victim Yoo had terrified and abducted using his fake police badge, breaks through the crowd.
She is driven entirely mad by grief, clutching an umbrella, and she charges at the man who butchered her daughter.
And the reaction of the state in that moment is inexcusable. The police escorting Yoo did not attempt to de-escalate the situation or gently intercept the grieving mother.
An officer, claiming he couldn't use his hands because he was holding the suspect, lifted his leg and delivered a violent, brutal kick directly to the mother's chest, throwing her backward onto the pavement.
The optics of that split second broke the country. You have the literal apparatus of the state physically assaulting the grieving mother of a victim in order to protect the physical safety of the serial killer that the state had previously released.
It was a match thrown into a powder keg. The narrative instantly expanded beyond Yoo Young-chul.
It became a profound indictment of a system that actively punished the innocent, ignored the vulnerable, and allowed predators to walk out the front door.
That visceral anger did not dissipate after the trial concluded. It seeped into the bedrock of the culture and sparked an institutional revolution that brings us directly to the sweeping reforms we are analyzing today in 2026.
The cultural footprint of the Raincoat Killer is massive. It fundamentally traumatized the national psyche and forced artists to process the grief.
In 2008, it inspired the critically acclaimed neo-noir thriller film, The Chaser.
That film perfectly captures the raw, visceral societal rage directed at the authorities. The protagonist of the film isn't a heroic, brilliant detective.
It's a disgraced, morally compromised ex-cop turned pimp, a direct parallel to the real-life parlor owner who actually caught you.
The film depicts the police as bumbling, politically motivated, and utterly useless, while the killer operates with terrifying impunity. It wasn't just a movie, it was an accurate reflection of exactly how the public viewed the Seoul Metropolitan Police.
And more recently, the 2021 Netflix docuseries, The Raincoat Killer, shifted the cultural lens away from the sensationalism of the cat and mouse chase.
It focused heavily on the enduring trauma of the victims' families and provided a surgical look at the specific institutional failures that permitted the spree.
It forced the public to ask, how did we let our pursuit of wealth blind us to the predators in our margins?
And the answer to that question eventually forced a total, ground-up reconstruction of South Korean justice. As we look at the landscape in 2026, the structural changes are truly historic.
For 78 years, South Korea operated under a legal framework where the prosecutor's office held near dictatorial centralized power over all investigations.
The police forces were largely subservient. They essentially took orders from prosecutors on how, when, and who to investigate.
This hierarchy created massive bureaucratic bottlenecks and was the primary breeding ground for the linkage blindness that allowed you to thrive.
So if the system was fundamentally broken, what is the mechanical reality of the fix? Did they simply rename the departments to appease the public, or did they alter the DNA of the investigative process?
They altered the DNA. By October of 2026, the traditional prosecutor's office, as it existed for nearly 8 decades, is being effectively abolished.
It is being bisected into 2 entirely distinct bodies. First, you have the creation of the Serious Crimes Investigation Agency, or the SCIA.
This agency operates under the Ministry of the Interior and Safety, entirely separate from the prosecutors. The SCIA is now solely responsible for handling major crimes, complex serial homicides, and large-scale corruption.
Second, you have the Public Prosecution Service, or the PPS. The PPS is stripped of its ability to initiate investigations and is focused exclusively on trial advocacy and managing indictments.
They've completely severed the power to investigate from the power to prosecute.
Yeah.
That is a massive check and balance.
Exactly. But the most critical evolution at the street level is the shift in investigative initiation power.
That power has been moved directly to integrated, modernized police teams. We now have the National Office of Investigation, the NOI.
The NOI structurally eliminates the isolated fiefdoms of the past. They utilize integrated cyber and forensic task forces that operate across all district lines.
If a hammer attack happens in Gangnam and a sex worker disappears in Mapo today, the NOI algorithms and centralized databases flag the anomaly immediately.
The structural linkage blindness that protected Yoo Young-chul for nearly a year is technologically and bureaucratically impossible within the new 2026 framework.
And a massive component of that modernization is the fact that the South Korean justice system was finally forced to adopt criminal profiling as a legitimate, necessary science.
Before the Raincoat Killer, behavioral analysis was largely dismissed by old-school Korean detectives as Western pseudoscience. They relied on traditional who benefits financially detective work.
But the U case proved definitively that traditional motives fail entirely when the driver is extreme psychological pathology. The system needed people who could understand the mind of the predator.
That paradigm shift was spearheaded by profiler Kwon Il-young, who conducted the extensive post-arrest interviews with you.
Kwon's work laid the foundational methodology for the modern behavioral analysis units within the NOI.
During those intense interrogation sessions, you demonstrated a terrifying level of self-awareness. He actively compared himself to the infamous American serial killer Richard Chase,
The Vampire of Sacramento, who also engaged in horrific postmortem mutilation and cannibalism.
But you chillingly noted to Kwon, Chase was mentally ill, but I am not.
That stark realization that an offender could be clinically sane, yet possess an unfathomable capacity for predatory violence, prove to the old guard that Korea desperately needed dedicated, highly trained behavioral analysts.
Which brings us to the lingering physical reality of Yoo Young-chul today. He was convicted and sentenced to death in December 2004. As we record this in March 2026, he remains alive, confined to death row at the Seoul Detention Center.
And his continued survival at that facility acts as the central anchor in a very intense, ongoing national debate.
South Korea maintains an unofficial moratorium on executions. The state has not actually put an inmate to death since 1997.
However, whenever human rights organizations or progressive politicians introduce legislation to officially abolish the death penalty, proponents of capital punishment point directly to the Raincoat Killer.
The original 2004 court ruling explicitly stated that the enormous pains inflicted on the families and society made any penalty less than death entirely inadequate. His existence paralyzes the abolition movement.
It is also a fascinating, albeit grim, twist of historical irony regarding who else occupies that facility. Currently, the Seoul Detention Center houses Yoo Young-chul, and it also houses former President Yoon Suk-yeol,
who was recently sentenced to life imprisonment following massive political scandals. You have a marginalized, poverty-stricken mass murderer and a disgraced former head of state occupying the same concrete complex.
It is a stark physical representation of the profound and turbulent shifts in the Korean political and judicial landscape over the last 2 decades.
The flawed system that initially failed to catch you has been methodically torn down, analyzed, and rebuilt entirely around the lessons his atrocities provided.
When we zoom out and look at the legacy of the Raincoat Killer, we realize that we are not simply studying a monster operating in a vacuum.
We are looking into a dark, unforgiving mirror that reflects the deliberate blind spots of a society. Yoo Young-chul was a clinical psychopath, yes, but his true terrifying power lay in his sociological awareness.
He understood exactly where the herd was refusing to look. He weaponized the invisible borders of society.
He targeted the wealthy elderly hidden away behind the massive iron-gated walls of their fortresses, knowing their isolation was a vulnerability.
And he targeted the marginalized sex workers who were actively ignored, stigmatized, and swept under the rug by the legal system.
He weaponized the apathy of the very institutions designed to protect people. He operated on the chilling logic that if he only destroyed the people society had either locked away in castles or discarded in the shadows, he could hunt with absolute impunity.
And that psychological reality brings us to the most critical, forward-looking point of our deep dive today. Yes, the South Korean police have radically reformed.
The investigative bureaus have modernized, the SCIA is active, and the NOI is utilizing cutting-edge cyber forensics.
The specific systemic cracks that you slipped through have been sealed. But the fundamental human vulnerability he exploited, social invisibility, has not disappeared.
In fact, it has evolved and expanded. The camouflage has simply changed.
We live in a world now where technology allows for unprecedented levels of anonymity. The global rise of the gig economy has fundamentally altered how we interact with service workers.
Transient anonymous labor is the new normal in almost every major metropolis on Earth.
The investigative machine is vastly superior in 2026, but no machine is perfect. There are always shadows on the periphery of the data.
So as we conclude this deep dive, we want to leave you with a provocation to consider in your own daily life. The institutions have changed, but human nature remains the same.
Ask yourself, who are the truly invisible people operating in your own city today?
Who are the individuals delivering your food late at night, cleaning the corporate high-rises after hours, or working entirely off the grid in the gig economy?
We walk past them every single day.
And the chilling question remains, what happens when the next apex predator realizes that, despite all our modern forensics, advanced algorithms, and new agency acronyms, society is still fundamentally failing to look closely enough at the margins?